The rain came down in thin, relentless sheets against the tall windows of the auction house in Richmond, blurring the city into streaks of grey. Inside, beneath the amber glow of chandelier light, Dr. Amelia Grant stood motionless before a small silvered photograph that most bidders had already dismissed. It was dated 1863. 3 young black women sat in an ornate parlor, dressed in silk gowns too fine for the world history had assigned them. Their backs were straight, their chins lifted, their expressions composed with the careful stillness of a long exposure. At first glance, the image seemed unremarkable, another relic of a divided nation, another artifact from the long shadow of the Civil War. Amelia had spent 20 years studying that shadow at Howard University, tracing its outlines through census ledgers and forgotten letters. She knew the visual language of 19th-century portraiture, the rigid symmetry, the sentimental props, the staged refinement meant to imply status. But as she leaned closer, something in the photograph resisted familiarity. It was not their faces that unsettled her, nor the improbable luxury of their dresses in Confederate Charleston. It was their hands. The eldest sister rested her right hand over her left, fingers parted just enough to break the elegance of the pose. The middle sister clasped her hands in her lap, thumbs crossing in a peculiar tension that seemed almost deliberate. The youngest held one palm flat against her skirt while the other curved subtly inward, as though shaping a letter only she could see. The gestures were slight, so slight that a casual observer would mistake them for artistic variation. But Amelia felt a chill move slowly up her spine. She had seen coded communication before. Quilts stitched with patterns that mapped escape routes. Spirituals layered with directions. Resistance did not always shout, sometimes it whispered, hidden in plain sight. The longer she studied the photograph, the more the symmetry dissolved into intention. These were not idle hands arranged for beauty. They were precise. Intentional. Speaking. She turned the card over. Faded ink read, The Kingsley Sisters, Charleston, 1863. The name stirred no recognition. No wealthy free black family by that name appeared in her memory of South Carolina records. And 1863, deep within Confederate territory, was no season for extravagance among black women, free or enslaved. The air in the room seemed to thin as a realization began to form, fragile but insistent. What if this was not merely a portrait? What if it was a message sent across enemy lines, disguised as gentility? Amelia felt the weight of history shift almost imperceptibly in her hands, as though the past itself were waiting for someone to finally notice what had always been there. The moment did not arrive with thunder or revelation. It came quietly, almost politely, as Dr. Amelia Grant adjusted the photograph beneath the auction house lamp and felt something refuse to settle in her mind. She had examined thousands of Civil War era portraits over the course of her career at Howard University. She knew the grammar of Victorian imagery, the stiff backs, the restrained expressions, the careful choreography of hands placed just so to signal refinement. In formal studio photography of the 1860s, hands were rarely accidental. They were arranged to soften the rigidity of the body, to suggest delicacy or authority, to balance the composition. Yet what she saw in the 1863 image of the so-called Kingsley sisters was not balance. It was variation. The eldest sister's right hand lay over her left, but the fingers were slightly spread, not relaxed. The gesture felt suspended, like a thought interrupted. The middle sister's hands were clasped, yet her thumbs crossed in a manner Amelia had never seen in conventional posing guides. The pressure looked intentional, almost tense. The youngest rested one palm flat against the fabric of her skirt while the other curved inward, forming a faint but deliberate shape. Individually, the gestures could have been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Amelia leaned closer, her breath fogging the protective glass for a fleeting second. She tried to reconstruct the photographer's likely instructions. In 1863 Charleston, deep within Confederate territory, 3 black women dressed in costly silk gowns would already have been an anomaly. The war was raging. Luxury was scarce. Freedom, even scarcer. Why then emphasize their hands with such careful distinctness? Why not mirror the poses, as symmetry demanded? Why allow each woman a unique configuration that subtly disrupted the visual harmony? Her pulse quickened as memory supplied parallels. She thought of coded quilts believed to mark safe houses, of spirituals whose lyrics concealed directions northward. Resistance had always found quiet forms. It hid in hymns, in stitching, in silence. It would not have been impossible for it to hide in posture. A photograph could travel where a letter could not. It could pass inspections without suspicion. To an untrained eye, it was only art. She straightened, the room around her receding into a low hum of distant conversation. For more than 150 years, viewers had looked at this image and seen exactly what they expected to see: 3 composed black women posed for a formal sitting. No one had questioned the choreography of their fingers. No one had asked whether the stillness was speaking. But now that she had noticed, she could not unsee it. The hands were not decorative. They were deliberate. And if they were deliberate, then the photograph was not passive documentation but an act of communication, a message concealed in elegance, waiting for someone patient enough to recognize that the silence was never empty. The discovery of the journal did not feel accidental, it felt inevitable, as though the past had grown impatient with being misunderstood. When Dr. Amelia Grant first learned that the faint embossed seal on the photograph read J. Whitmore, Charleston, she expected little more than confirmation of authorship. Jonathan Whitmore, records showed, had operated a photography studio in Charleston from 1858 through the final years of the Civil War. He was white, from a respected Southern family, known for documenting the city's elite. Nothing in the official summaries hinted at rebellion. Nothing suggested danger. Yet history often concealed its sharpest edges beneath respectable surfaces. The breakthrough came in a restricted archive room in Charleston, where an aging leather journal rested inside a climate-controlled case. Donated anonymously in the mid-20th century and later identified as Whitmore's through handwriting analysis, the journal had been catalogued but never deeply examined for subtext. Its entries, at first glance, appeared mundane: lists of clients, references to deliveries, notations about weather and supply shortages. But Amelia had learned to read silence as carefully as text. Certain phrases repeated with peculiar consistency: packages secured, routes confirmed, light favorable for passage. They were not the vocabulary of portrait commissions. They were logistical. Then she found the entry dated March 1863. The 3 sisters sat for their portrait today. The message is embedded. If our friends in the North understand the code, the next passage will proceed as planned. God protect them all. The word seemed to vibrate on the fragile paper. Embedded. Code. Passage. Amelia read the lines again, slower this time, her mind assembling the implications with growing urgency. Whitmore was not simply recording a sitting, he was documenting an operation. The photograph she had purchased was not a decorative artifact but a vehicle. It had carried information disguised as refinement, traveling across state lines under the harmless guise of art. The journal entries that followed confirmed what the single paragraph suggested. Whitmore described a network that had adapted to wartime scrutiny by transforming ordinary portraiture into encrypted correspondence. Photographs, he noted, could move freely through checkpoints, purchased by collectors, mailed to relatives, displayed openly in parlors. Unlike letters, they aroused little suspicion. And within them, through gestures, props, patterns, messages could be led so subtly that only trained eyes would detect them. The sisters were not identified by the name written on the back of the auction print. That, too, was part of the concealment. Whitmore referred to them only by first names in later entries, careful, almost reverent. He detailed meetings arranged under the pretense of dress fittings, coded exchanges disguised as artistic adjustments. The camera, an instrument often associated with documentation and control, had been repurposed into a tool of defiance. As Amelia closed the journal, her hands trembled with a realization both exhilarating and sobering. The Confederacy had searched for spies in letters, in whispered conversations, in intercepted couriers. It had not thought to search in silvered glass. The war, it seemed, had been fought not only on battlefields but in parlors, beneath studio lights, inside the quiet click of a shutter that captured far more than a likeness and far more than anyone had ever imagined. Decoding the March 1863 photograph was neither quick nor dramatic. It unfolded slowly, like a lock resisting the key that had finally found it. Dr. Amelia Grant spread copies of the image across her desk, surrounding them with transcriptions from Whitmore's journal and notes drawn from military records of the war's coastal campaigns. She worked beneath the quiet hum of her office at Howard University, aware that if her emerging theory proved true, it would alter more than a footnote in Civil War scholarship. It would challenge the very architecture of who was credited with intelligence and strategy. The journal entry from March 1863 had been specific, the message was embedded, and that next passage would proceed if understood. Amelia began with the hands. Clara's right hand resting over her left, fingers subtly parted, matched a diagram in Elizabeth's cipher guide indicating a date window, the first week of June. Ruth's clasped hands with crossed thumbs corresponded to a river crossing symbol, one used in the guide to designate the Combahee River ferry point in South Carolina. Viola's flat palm with curved fingers translated into a number range approximating 700. Each element alone suggested possibility. Together, they suggested precision. Amelia cross-referenced the projected date with known Union operations in the region. In early June 1863, a significant military action took place along the Combahee River under the leadership of Harriet Tubman. On June 2, Tubman guided Union gunboats through mined Confederate waters, leading what would become known as the Combahee River Raid. The raid liberated more than 750 enslaved people in a single night and destroyed key Confederate supply lines. Historians had long marveled at the operation's accuracy, how Union forces navigated dangerous waterways and struck plantations with startling efficiency. The photograph's additional details deepened the connection. The lace pattern on Clara's collar matched a cipher entry indicating naval assistance. Buttons on Ruth's sleeves confirmed local guide secured. A ribbon arrangement on Viola's bodice identified the operation's leader by the biblical codename Moses, widely associated in abolitionist circles with Tubman herself. It was not poetic coincidence, it was structured intelligence. Amelia felt the implication settle with immense gravity. The sisters' portrait, taken months before the raid, had likely circulated northward through abolitionist networks. Encoded within its elegance was confirmation that the river route was navigable, that Confederate defenses were vulnerable, that the number of people awaiting extraction was vast. The image was not symbolic resistance, it was tactical communication. For generations, the Combahee River Raid had been attributed to Tubman's extraordinary courage and Union coordination, yet the origin of her precise intelligence remained partially obscured. Now, in the quiet geometry of three women's hands, Amelia saw evidence that the information may have been gathered, encrypted, and transmitted by black women operating in plain sight. The photograph was no longer an artifact of passive survival but a strategic instrument that helped orchestrate one of the most successful liberation missions of the Civil War, revealing that beneath the surface of recorded history lay a network of brilliance that had gone unrecognized for more than a century. If the coded hand position suggested intention, the cipher guide proved architecture. When Helen, the descendant of the white seamstress who had sheltered the sisters, placed the small worn booklet into Dr. Amelia Grant's hands, the weight of it felt disproportionate to its size. The pages were fragile, filled with meticulous sketches of collars, cuffs, lace trims, ribbon placements, pleat directions, and button arrangements. Beside each drawing was a notation, sometimes a word, sometimes a number, sometimes a symbol that only made sense when cross-referenced with another page. What Amelia had first believed to be decorative fashion choices were revealed as components of a deliberate language stitched into fabric. The guide belonged to Elizabeth, a Charleston dressmaker whose business had appeared respectable and apolitical during the war. Yet beneath that respectable facade operated one of the most sophisticated intelligence systems of the Confederate South. Elizabeth's husband, outwardly loyal to the Confederacy, had access to troop movements, supply routes, and fortification plans. According to family testimony and surviving correspondence, he relayed information to Elizabeth, who then translated it into patterns that could travel undetected. The seamstresses, Clara, Ruth, and Viola among them, became fluent in this textile code. Amelia studied the March 1863 photograph again, this time not as a historian of images but as a reader of garments. The lace on Clara's collar was not merely ornate, its repeating rose motif corresponded to safe passage. Vertical stitching along the bodice of Ruth's gown, nearly invisible in casual viewing, aligned with the guide's notation for the danger reduced when paired with specific sleeve buttons. Viola's ribbon placement, asymmetrical and deliberate, mapped onto a page indicating leadership confirmation. Even the number of decorative buttons, 3 groups near the wrist, 2 spaced along the forearm, communicated quantities and readiness. The brilliance of the system lay in its layering. A single element might convey a general signal, but combined with hand positions and photographic staging, the message became detailed and actionable. A Confederate officer inspecting a portrait would see nothing more than fashionable attire. A Union contact trained in the cipher would see coordinates, dates, numbers, and risk assessments. Fashion became encryption. Elegance became intelligence. What struck Amelia most forcefully was the invisibility of it all. In a society that dismissed black women as ornamental or subordinate, these same women weaponized ornamentation. Silk and lace, materials associated with gentility and domesticity, were transformed into conduits of subversion. The camera amplified the reach of the code. A dress seen by dozens in a Charleston parlor might be noted and memorized, but captured in a photograph, it could be duplicated and carried hundreds of miles without alteration. The cipher guide dismantled any lingering doubt that the sister's portrait had been accidental or symbolic. It was procedural, structured, collaborative. The dresses were not costumes, they were documents. And in those threads ran intelligence capable of shifting military outcomes, hidden within beauty so convincing that it shielded itself from suspicion for more than a century. The reunion of the descendants did not begin with speeches or ceremony. It began with hesitation. For generations, their family histories had contained fragments, whispers of teaching, hints of hardship, stories softened by time. None of them had grown up hearing that their ancestors had been part of a covert intelligence network during the Civil War. They knew of survival. They did not know of strategy. When Dr. Amelia Grant first contacted them with copies of the 1863 photograph and excerpts from Whitmore's journal, the responses ranged from disbelief to quiet awe. Michael, a retired postal worker in Chicago, stared at the image for a long time before speaking. He had always been told that his great-great-grandmother Ruth became a teacher after emancipation, that she valued education fiercely. Seeing her seated in silk, her hands folded in coded defiance, reframed everything he thought he understood about inheritance. Patricia, a school principal in Detroit descended from Clara, wept when she noticed the resemblance between the woman in the photograph and her own daughter, the same steady gaze, the same composed posture. James, a musician in Atlanta and a descendant of Viola, felt something deeper still when Amelia explained that Viola had taught music at a freedman school, embedding lessons in rhythm and repetition. He recalled melodies passed down through his family, tunes without origin stories, and wondered whether resistance had echoed through his childhood without his knowing. They agreed to meet in Charleston, near where Jonathan Whitmore's studio once stood. The original building was gone, replaced by modern facades and curated tourism, but the air still carried the weight of history. When the families gathered, they formed a loose circle, each holding a reproduction of the photograph that had survived war, neglect, and erasure. Strangers by geography, they found immediate recognition in shared features, shared gestures, shared quiet strength. The public acknowledgement followed soon after. Amelia's research was published, and eventually the original photograph was acquired by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture for an exhibit dedicated to hidden resistance networks of the Civil War. On opening night, the descendants stood together before the illuminated image of Clara, Ruth, and Viola. Visitors moved slowly through the gallery, reading about coded hands, encrypted lace, and intelligence disguised as art. For the first time, the sisters' names were spoken in a space of national memory rather than family lore. Patricia addressed the gathered crowd, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She spoke not of revenge or bitterness, but of visibility, of how history had long celebrated generals while overlooking the women who stitched strategy into silk. Around her, museum lights reflected softly off the glass protecting the photograph. The sisters' hands, once dismissed as decorative, now commanded attention. Their descendants stood tall beneath them, no longer searching for missing chapters in their lineage but reclaiming a legacy of courage that had waited more than a century to be fully seen.